Hello and welcome to the Hindu's live webinar on COP29, the global climate conference, which is underway right now in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, the oil-rich nation where it's taking place. For the next 11 days, all the countries worldwide are going to take stock of their climate pledges. They're going to take stock of various issues, particularly at this COP, whether developed countries can up their or pivot rather from the $100 billion that they had pledged in 2009 in Copenhagen COP, which they said they would pay every year for developing and least developed countries to adapt and mitigate climate change. And of course, set up at Egypt, at COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, to discuss these developments and also to give us insights into just what happened at the inaugural session of COP that took place, as I understand, from Chetan Bhattacharjee, senior journalist who's been covering climate for some time now, who joins us from Baku. At 10:30 a.m. is when the inaugural session began there. Chetan, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this live webinar of the Hindu at short notice. And of course, this is the second time that you're attending a COP. As I understand, or maybe you've attended that before, you can clarify. If you can first tell us just what happened at the inaugural session. I remember you sort of, letting me know that there was a report tabled by the WMO. So if you can walk us through that and also sort of tell us what sort of agenda we can expect in the next couple of weeks. Chetan.
Thanks, Kadal, and thanks very much for having me over. And this is my third COP. The first one was in Delhi, believe it or not, all those decades ago. Uh, Coming to your question,
All right.
the WMO recently, just about a couple of hours ago, had a press conference where they basically said it was a state of the climate report and it was bad news in the sense that the world is warming, and they had new statistics to point that out. The Secretary General said that they're sending out a red alert, and she said that it's one of the many in the past year or so, and that is another SOS on the state of the planet. So it was almost defeatist, but it was also a big alert that, a call for action from the leaders who will be assembling over here. What they pointed out was this, that the average global warming is 1.3 degrees higher than the pre-industrial times. 1 year ago, at the time of the last COP, it was 1.2 degrees warmer. That apart, this particular year is the hottest ever recorded. Last year, it was the hottest ever recorded, but this year it's hotter by 1.5 degrees. Last year, it was hotter by 1.4 degrees. There's slight nuances, there's small numbers, but these numbers matter. And they went on to explain on how they matter in terms of more frequent, more intense droughts, heat waves, flooding, storms, and so on and so forth. And we've seen a whole list of tragedies, disasters in this current year, where we've seen these kind of disasters rolling out. They also did point out on one more thing, that the sea level rise is accelerating. What they meant was that the long-term rate of sea level rise has more than doubled, is what they pointed out, since the satellite record system started, and it's gone up from about 2 millimeters to about 4.5 millimeters, so almost 5 millimeters in the last decade or so. So worrying statistics, and the main point was that the global leaders must take this into account, that the climate crisis is intensifying year by year, and they can't afford to wait any longer to take action. The most decisive action that they can take is to cut back on, start rapidly cutting back on fossil fuels, on burning fossil
Right.
fuels.
Right. So, right. And coming to that, at the Glasgow COP, in fact, I've written about it for the Hindu as well. India and China really stood out, asking for a coal phase down as opposed to a coal phase out, which was demanded by the developed countries. And there was much ado about Britain having phased out coal this year. But in reality, most of Western Europe and the United States, in fact, draw enormous amounts of their energy now from oil and gas. In fact, liquefied natural gas which is really the mainstay for most of conventional energy, which is there in Europe, used to be, of course, we know, used to be supplied by Russia, 40% of it, which they have considerably reduced. Now it's literally the other way around. The United States supplies 40% of the of LNG to power most of Western Europe, and this is really the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's not been addressed. Oil very much powers transport. It powers aviation. It powers shipping. I mean, to some extent, and of course, it even powers a lot of production processes in most parts of the world. So while there's been this huge emphasis on coal, oil has sort of not been really looked at. And it's something that the developing world and the developed countries pointed out when they were being asked to phase out coal. So, and now that it's actually taking place in an oil-rich country where 90% of its revenues come from oil, do you think that this might gain more attention, or is this going to be, as many think, quite a washout, since it's since the presidentship is itself with an oil-rich country?
That's a very good point. And don't forget that the United States is the largest producer of oil and gas, as Trump and many others have continuously pointed out in recent months. Um, it's being seen as a washout. It's been called as a lackluster COP. People are not expecting much. And the fact is that many world leaders are not coming. There was one report which said Biden is not coming, President Biden is not coming, President Xi is not coming, Prime Minister Modi last heard was not coming. Neither are the leaders of France, Germany, Australia, and several others. And not just that, even leaders of small island states are not coming. For instance, Papua New Guinea's representatives have called it a total waste of time. And the foreign minister was quoted as saying that these summits have produced no results, as Pacific nations have taken the rare step of withdrawing from this COP. So, what is expected, what is not expected is, and whether oil and gas will be addressed. As of now, the signals are that it won't be addressed in that much at that level. There is broad talks about them calling for a sort of a reduction in fossil fuel, but it's not really. There's nothing concrete on the table. Not just Azerbaijan, even last COP was held in a petro state. There have been criticisms by activists and officials, climate officials, to say that they should not. Such important climate discussions should not, and summit should not happen in these petro states. The WHO, in a recent statement, had also said that we have to restrict, or that the organizers must restrict fossil fuel industry interactions within national policy spaces and international fora such as COP. Now, that is a very strong statement to make by a UN body. Coming back to your question on coal versus oil and gas, that's not really dominating the discourse as much as it did in Glasgow. It is, of course, forefront because both are fossil fuels, but which camp is going to win, whether it'll be the India-China camp who say that they have to rely on coal for energy security and to pull millions out of poverty, and historically it was the rich developed nations who have burnt more than their fair share of coal. That is something that may not fully play out decisively in this crop.
Right. So, that's that's quite sad. And as you rightly pointed out, this is a second petro state. Dubai was again also considered to be a difficult COP, if we may say so. And as you rightly pointed out, the sort of numbers, the variations in the WMO report might be a 0.1 degree or decimal of a variation, but that means huge catastrophes which we've already faced, like Cyclone Helene in the United States, the unprecedented flooding and rains in Spain. Of course, we in India have faced Cyclone Asna, and then more recently several other extreme weather events in India. So it's not quite anymore a situation where we attempt to address climate change in the sense that it is something that we always considered in the abstract and future, but it's here and we're facing it now every year. This particular COP was supposed to, or rather is supposed to address just, you know, just how much the developed world can go in terms of committing to finance
Mm,
mitigation and adaptation. If you recall in 2009, and thanks for reminding me that you attended the Delhi COP. That was eons ago. I don't even remember now the year, but as you said, in 2009. As I'd mentioned, in at Copenhagen, there was a commitment that the developed world would pump in about $100 billion every year. If we
mm,
were to have seen that commitment actually taken seriously, we would have gotten to 1.4 trillion by this year. And we're
mm.
still talking about just that commitment not being met, which for the first time was met a couple of years ago. So uh, if going by any of the past experience, I would wager that we would not really get any serious commitments to go beyond that 100 billion. But is there any hope?
I'd probably back your wager, also support it as well. I think the Copenhagen fund was supposed to come in after a few years, so the total would have been a bit less than $1 trillion, if I remember correctly. But I think the key word that you used is seriously. The point is that not only was the funding, the collection slow, but they crossed the target of 100 billion was delayed, and it was crossed as recently as 2022. Now, one of the things that they're expected to do is cough up a lot more money, a lot more finance. What are the chances of that happening? Very bleak. Um, there's a new finance mechanism, the new collective quantified goal, which needs consensus and needs to be rolled out next year. But if you see the two targets, the rich developed nations are barely able to cough up to $100 billion a year. What developing nations, global south countries like India and others have said is that it's going to cost at least $1 trillion a year up to 2030, possibly more under some circumstances, to finance clean energy, a green transition, a just transition. How this will happen, that too in a matter of a few months, is very unclear. You also have to see that the West, the developed countries, they're facing a whole bunch of their own problems. Like in the US, you've got a climate denier who's president-elect. You've got inflation. You've got trade wars. You've got tit for tat trade wars, and barricades, trade barriers being set up. In this entire, as well as as well as two wars. So in this atmosphere of mistrust, you have to push through and ask the developed countries for a lot of finance. The chances of that happening are clearly very bleak, but hopefully the next 10, 12 days will see some kind of breakthroughs, at least if nothing else, that they will agree to keep talking and talk frequently until, they make some kind of headway.
Right. And the other, of course, speaking of finance, the other major aspect of this is rather going to be the operationalization of the loss and damage fund, which was set up at Sharm el Sheikh last year. As you pointed out, the crossing of that 100 billion threshold happened, I believe, at Dubai. But if going by the sort of lukewarm response to the earlier commitment of 100 billion, um, do we expect the operationalization of the loss and damage fund to be meaningful, in the sense that is it actually really going to take into consideration the extreme weather events that small island nations who are actually not attending this COP already facing? What loss and damage defines as irreversible and long-term climate change effects, or are we going to sort of see a further what do we say cop out by the developed world, because this is again an extension of the same financial instruments that they might have to use.
True. It is ready. People are waiting for the loss and damages fund to be operationalized this time. So far, the amount that is being committed or being pledged, I think, is well under $1 billion, if I'm not mistaken. I think last it was $475 million, which was pledged, and I'm not sure how much more that has really gone up to so far. Uh, but the rules around it, the framework, the transparency, something that India has been demanding, all that needs to be worked out. Um, Hopefully, this is one of the low-hanging fruits which can be worked out. Experts have pointed out that loss and damage financing requires grants, basically money that can be just given to a particular community or a country or a territory to for the loss and damages that they have faced. But where's the money going to come from? This will have to come from probably, buckets of aid money. Those are anyway drying up. They're not been growing as they used to. So there are very tough questions. It is I would say, a low-hanging fruit in terms of the quantum of money. It requires far less than, say, adaptation and mitigation. Um, Whether this is something that can be a success story from this COP, I think it's still early days.
Right. And Chetan, I mean, on a broader sort of geopolitical economic position, you already referred to Donald Trump, President-elect of the United States, being a climate denier. We are entering another era, or I don't know if this might be reversed in the future at some point, but this is another 4 years of at least American leadership on climate being withdrawn. We saw that when Trump was the 45th president of the United States. Joe Biden came in and significantly attempted to restore that. And domestically, they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually had several climate aspects of it. Of course, globally, it was criticized for being very protectionist. And protectionism might actually hinder climate goals. Several climate researchers, climate advocates have pointed out that technology transfer is key for climate adaptation and mitigation, and the developed world really needs to sort of, be accountable, come up and give those technology quite readily to countries that face severe climate issues. And in this case, if we are entering a sort of an era of protectionism economically, I would think that those sort of critical technologies, which the least developed countries, small island nations, and developing countries like India need, might also be restricted. Are there going to be conversations about how one might uh, overcome this sort of conventional economic protectionism to actually address climate issues at this COP?
Uh, there might not be mainstream conversations around this in the sense of out in the open and discussions, but these have been very integral to the climate discussions for a long, long time. And there has been little headway. Essentially, to simplify it for the viewers, what it means is that the rich countries are being called upon by the developing countries to transfer clean tech and to do it without licensing, without any kind of payments, or at least very reduced payments, given that this is a crisis situation. It really hasn't happened too much.
Or even
Um,
patenting, for that matter. Patenting is something that India
yeah,
has raised.
correct.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm
Exactly,
sorry.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those battles are still being fought. In the middle of all this, you have President Trump coming in, and I mean, one of the things people over here are very concerned about is that he will not just withdraw from the Paris Agreement, but also from the UNFCCC, the charter, the framework under which all countries have been participating in climate summits and climate dialogues for again about 3 decades or so. Now. Whether there will be any progress on this, again, it's very hard to say. I doubt it. The headwinds are pretty strong this time. However, the chief of the UN climate change body, Simon Steele, has today said that he essentially hinting at the US has appealed to the largest and wealthiest nations and their self-interest. And he's basically said, you got to dispense with any idea that climate finance is charity. You have to see climate finance as entirely in the self-interest of your nation, of every nation, including, as he pointed out, the largest and the wealthiest. Whether the US, the new US government can see any kind of business self-interest, any kind of deal making that is possible within this, it is a possibility, given a lot of the Republican states have responded very well to renewable energy projects, and they are said to be doing, pretty good in those businesses.
Right, right. So there is a possibility that if the US sort of like vacates the space, clearly China will take a stage, regardless of how the West views it. Um, that remains to be seen. But I wanted to, sort of ask you a final question and then leave it open for our registrants to ask questions as well, if there are any. What is India specifically expecting from this COP, and what is one is what are India's demands, and what is sort of the broader Indian expectation that they want to take away from?
Well, look, actually, I mean, India's expectations and indeed the expectations of many in the developed world are exactly the opposite. I mean, you just have to flip the previous question and answer. They want access to clean tech. They want much larger funding, finance, especially from the developed nations. There are new and very significant irritants like the carbon tax that Europe has imposed. That is going to be a major talking point at this COP, and indeed it has been at various platforms, global platforms, even outside the climate discussions, because that is being seen as an unfair trade barrier. India has also wanted more transparency. It has positioned itself, especially since G20 in Delhi last year, as a leader of the global South. For these aspects, I think it will be adopting a more. It will lay out what it wants in terms of actions by the developed nations, by the rich economies. How much of that is going to be met? How much of that is going to be, accepted? Is again up in the air. Now, that's pretty much the tone of what we've been saying and what others have been saying. There's a lot of pressing action that needs to be taken, particularly on finance, transfer of green technologies, and so on and so forth. But there's very little signs of that actually being rolled out this COP. There is some low-hanging fruit, like I said, loss and damages, for instance, possibly an agreement for the NCGQ, if I've got that, GC, yeah, if I got that correct. We should probably expect some movement, but not at the level that we would want it to happen, given all the kind of climate blowbacks that we're getting in terms of, more and more disasters.
Right, right.
NCQGs.
Well, I think we've
yeah.
really covered significant ground. Right, yeah. I think we've covered significant ground, and you've given a really broad sweep of what's happening there in Baku. And hopefully, as you said, there are some low-hanging fruits that might actually be worked upon and delivered. But if I can just check to see if we have comments, and if there are viewer comments, there's someone says that they're watching this from the COP29 delegate pavilion. We don't have any questions yet, I'm being told. So in closing, you're going to be there for about a week. Typically the jostling and the final text happens in the last week, from whatever, my experience of not really actually attending, but covering it from India. Given that it might actually be sort of lackluster, do we expect that sort of jostling the way, what happened in say at Glasgow, where there was a serious jostling between phase down and phase out, and then again in Sharm el Sheikh about the loss and damage fund, etc. It doesn't appear that there is a sort of a paradigm shift in that process, but given the lackluster sort of approach by most global leaders, might this just close without any strong commitments?
Well, look, there may be two ways of looking at this, and I'm just sticking my neck out over here. One is that in the absence of the top leaders, the negotiators, the people in the room who are actually getting the work done, they might actually be able to make some kind of progress with the spotlights on their leaders out of the picture. But on the other hand, this is a pivotal COP. I know that is usually spoken about for several COPs, but in this, we are on the precipice of crossing the 1.5 over the next few years. If we don't start taking actions, there are a lot of deadlines that have to be met. One is, as I said, the NCQG fund, the funding mechanism. The second is the NDCs, the nationally determined, the promises that each country has to deliver. That
Contributions.
is in contributions in the next 3 months, I think, by Feb. And that will make it clear if all the countries together are on the right path to avoid the 1.5 degree limit that we're supposed to be trying to avoid. So yeah, next year is going to be pivotal. A lot of that work has to be done in the next 10, 12 days. How much of that they're going to achieve is, of course, remains to be seen. But there are certainly some doable things like the NDCs, maybe the NCQG, maybe the loss and damages fund can be operationalized. Fingers crossed.
Right. Right. Thank you so much, Chetan. I think we sort of covered quite a lot of ground in this chat. And of course, you're going to be writing for us as well from there in the time that you're going to be there. So we hope you bring us more insights. And to our viewers and those who have joined in, thank you so much for being with us. Hope you join us for such webinars again later, and follow us on your various favorite social media platforms, as well as our website and app. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.